My sisters and brothers, for the first reading to make more sense, it's helpful to have a mini lesson in ancient geopolitical politics. Prior to the birth of Christ, about 100 to 150 years before the birth of Jesus, you had a very famous conquest going on. You remember who it was that was coming out of what is modern-day Macedonia and Greece? Who conquered? He gave his name, in fact, to cities all over the ancient Near East. Alexander. Alexander is important because Alexander comes up out of Macedonia and he starts to conquer to the east. He gets as far as what is modern-day India before he dies. By the way, for all of the budding philosophers among you, he drug Aristotle along with him. Aristotle will show up later in metaphysics, ethics, and natural sciences. But put Aristotle on the back burner and keep Alexander in front of your mind, because he is the real focus of what's happening in the first reading. When Alexander starts to go east, and he goes into what is now modern-day Turkey, what is now modern-day Lebanon, what is modern-day Syria, Israel, all the way to Egypt and to India, he not only creates this giant empire, he brings with him Greek language and Greek culture. He is the reason that the New Testament is written in Greek. He is the reason that you have people like St. Paul running around, who was born in Tarsus but speaks Greek. He is the one that if you went back and you were to teleport yourself back in time and you were to see St. Joseph working in Nazareth, probably in the Decapolis, the Greek-speaking cities, or the Syro-Phoenician woman that we hear about in the Gospel of Mark, you can thank all of that to Alexander the Great. He is the one that would bring Greek culture and language into the ancient Near East and India. Now, this becomes important because he not only brings the Greek language, the Greek arts, and the Greek culture, but also the Greek deities. He is bringing Zeus and Apollo and Athena and company along with him. When all of this is going on at the height of his success, he dies. And his empire is split up among his generals. One of them takes control of the area that is now the ancient Near East. And so we're getting a little bit closer to the birth of Jesus. We're within about 100 years. And how do you show that you have conquered this new territory? What do you do to show that you're now in charge? They didn't have flagpoles. So what do you think that they put in the temple in Jerusalem? A statue to who? Their gods or the conquered people's gods? You put your God in their temple, right? Because it shows our God is better than your God and our God beat your God. To condense everything that's happened in the first and second book of Maccabees, that will give rise not only to the persecution that you're hearing about in the second reading, it also will give rise, and go back and read about this in the first book of Maccabees, to the revolt of Judas Maccabeus, also known as the Hasmonean dynasty, that would come to power in light of part of this revolt that you're hearing about today would eventually come out of that. Now, the Hasmoneans are important because they're going to show up again. They'll show up in the gospel. Now, who is the king of Israel, do we say? It is Jesus, because he is descended from who? Jesus is son of? Yes, but he descends from what kingly line in Israel? David. Remember, Jesus is the son of David. In fact, we hear that when Jesus goes into Jerusalem, Hosanna to the son of David. Herod the Great, who's the great builder, and he's the one you hear about of Slaughter the Innocents fame, and his son Herod Antipas, who you'll remember from crucifying Jesus several chapters later in Matthew's Gospel, are descended from this group of people who are at war with the Greeks and eventually set up the independent state of Israel, but they are not related to the Davidic kings. And that becomes a problem when Jesus comes along claiming, or at least is claimed for him, that he descends from the line of David and therefore has theological and political argument to take the throne away from Herod. That's why that'll become important in a few decades. But what you're hearing about is the last time Israel will be a unique and independent nation. They will go from about the year 140, 145 BC until 66 BC, when the Roman Empire will come in and take them over. After the Romans come in 66, when is the next time Israel is an independent state? Anyone remember? 1948. From 66 BC to 1948, there is no independent state of Israel. As a side note, and also of the same importance geopolitically that when all of this is going on, Egypt is also in the middle of a great tug of war, and out of what will become in the late 50s and 40s, a minor princess born in Syria will eventually rise to take the throne in Egypt. She will become, at least publicly, a lover of Julius Caesar and claims to have a child by him. She will be the last ruler of an independent Egypt until 1945. So from about the same time Israel is taken over until 1945, about the time Israel incidentally becomes independent, one woman kept Egypt free, and that's Cleopatra VII of Cleopatra and Mark Antony fame, and Cleopatra and Julius Caesar fame. She will be the last independent ruler of an independent Egypt until modern times. The reason that this is also important and gets so much traction in the liturgy and in the Bible is it is this period of destruction and this period of unrest that makes people start to question, is this the end of the world? Because God's sanctuary has been violated with this pagan statue. Does it mean that God has abandoned the people of Israel? Does it mean we are at the end of time? And of course, lots of people said yes, and here we are 2,000 years later. But the reason that this event is so important is it also is the beginning of where we see a very clear understanding that despite present ills, as clearly this woman and her sons are going through, it is not the end, because they are looking forward to the resurrection. They're expecting God to reverse their fortune in the fullness of time and in the resurrection and the life to come. By the time that Alexander is running around, that is already a part of Jewish theology. By the time of Jesus, some Jewish groups accepted it, some didn't. And it becomes very important because when we start to hear Jesus preaching about the resurrection, and as we reflect on what the church teaches us about the resurrection, it separates out why the Sadducees' question does not make sense. Because resurrection is not resuscitation. This is not God performing magical CPR. This is not God taking the jaws of life, cutting you out of your body, zapping you with the paddles, and sending you on your way. Resurrection, as Jesus points out, is a complete change to how we live. It is a complete renewal and bringing back to what God intends, which is life without end. It's important that we remember that when God created, when we go back to the book of Genesis, God did not will death. God did not will sin. God did not will death. God did not will destruction. All of these things enter into the world because of sin. And in the resurrection, God is completely repairing and completely restoring all of creation that has been affected by sin and sin's effect. God overcomes the power of evil and death in the power of the resurrection made manifest in the person of Christ. And it's to that question of resurrection that the Sadducees debate. Now, as a side note, you notice that they ask the question, whose wife will she be? Keep in mind, this is a world that allows you to have more than one wife. So why couldn't she have 7 husbands? Just saying, if you can do one, you can do the other. But be that as it may, notice the resurrection completely changes the life of the person, restoring completely what sin had destroyed, restoring completely all creation. And in the complete and perfect union with God, there is no giving and receiving in marriage, because marriage, we teach, ends when? Until what do you part? Until death do you part. So she cannot be married to any of these people. Why? Because the marriage ended at death. So she can't rise married to any of these people. The marriage ended at death. And in the resurrection, when all of creation is made perfect, there is no giving and receiving in marriage, because all of creation is in perfect union with God. The purpose of the sacrament of marriage, my sisters and brothers, is to reflect and to give evidence of the union of Christ and the church. It is to make manifest the relationship of Christ and the church united to each other and bringing through that union the love of God into the world. And when that has been made perfect, and all creation is once again restored and at peace, there is no giving and receiving, because there is perfect union with God. It is not to denigrate marriage or to put marriage on a back burner, but to say that the cause of it, and indeed of all the sacraments, will completely cease. There is no sacrament of reconciliation in heaven. Why? Because there's no sin. There is no going to receive the sacrament of the sick and of anointing in heaven. Why? Because nobody is sick. That all these things that are bringing us along, urging us and giving us the grace of salvation, are found to be perfected in the resurrection. And so when we become perfectly united with God, all these things that we needed to help us along are no longer necessary. The woman in the first reading sees and knows that God's perfection is coming, and God's restoration for her and for her children is coming, and so she has the courage to continue to be faithful. We don't hear it here, but she continues also her children to be faithful, promising them that God's fidelity is stronger than the power of sin and death, stronger than Alexander's empire, as the disciples will say a few generations later, stronger than the power of the Roman Empire. And so we too are reminded, as we approach the feast of Christ the King, that all these things we are afraid of, all these things that separate us, we are reminded are not the end. The end is the resurrection of the just and the complete restoration of all creation, the complete healing from all sin and its effect. And all these things that we have depended on to get us to resurrection, once we cross that line, are no longer necessary, because the separation between God and creation will no longer exist. My sisters and brothers, as we approach the feast of Christ the King, we are looking towards what is the goal of God, which is to restore us and indeed to restore all creation to unity and harmony. for all creation to experience perfectly and fully the love of God. And at times on this side of eternity, it is difficult. It is not easy. At times, as we know, it is frightening and even painful. But as the woman in the first reading reminds us, and as her sons remind us, it is not the end. The end is the resurrection and the life promised to us in baptism, that God is guiding us through the life of the Eucharist and the sacraments, so that someday, when we too pass away and die in this life, for us too it will not be the end, but rather the beginning of eternity, where God will be united with us for all time.